there. This is James Taylor, and this is my oral presentation for the final exam. So we'll get started off by talking about the lecture that we had with Dr. Eric Blomberg, and he discussed management of the American woodcock. And so, what exactly is an American woodcock? Taxonomically speaking, it is a shorebird, but it actually lives in upland forested areas. These are normally young, disturbed forests, so like secondary succession, sort of. And then earthworms make up 90 to 95% of their diet. So a really fascinating bird that I see often in the Piedmont and upstate of South Carolina. And he discussed that there are actually two different management regions for this species. There is the eastern, which is along the Atlantic seaboard, and then there's the central, which are the states adjacent to that, like Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, all of those kind of up and down up to Ohio. And so they're kind of managed differently because historically they assumed that there was relatively little crossover. But some of the big key takeaways from this study was that latitude affects fall departure. Basically, 4 days per 1 degree northward will they move earlier. And it's way more than longitude, and it's a very strong effect, especially when you compare adults and young woodcocks. Young woodcock leave roughly 5 days later than mature woodcock. And then this kind of explains roughly 61% variability in fall departure. The second takeaway was that fall stopover timing is highly variable. So basically, adult females are the ones that migrate the most rapidly. And then breeding latitude best predicts winter arrival time. And this was talking about it's not as strong as departure. It's only 1.2 days per degree, but it's much greater variability in arrival time. And then wintering longitude predicts spring migration departure. So basically, more western birds migrate before eastern birds, roughly 1 day per degree. And males leave roughly 6 days earlier than females, which is really interesting. I guess they're trying to get to breeding grounds um, earlier. And then body condition also affects these departure dates, which is really interesting, but differs between males and females. And then at the end of the study, they found that what they thought were two distinct populations actually cross over decently a decent amount of times, especially the eastern population. Those birds cross over into the central region roughly 29% of the time. And then the opposite way, so central to eastern, it's only 4%. So it's a really fascinating study that they were doing on a really interesting bird that I've always enjoyed, and I love seeing their mating calls and everything. So then the next thing we're going to talk about is the energy production and the impacts on birds. So I chose to look into coal mining, the mountaintop removal type. And the paper that I found was from C.M. Lutuma et al. In 2021, and it was called Terrestrial Wildlife in the Post-Mine Appalachian Landscape Status and Opportunities. And so basically, they start off by stating that like these mountaintop mines really affect a lot of things, but birds are really affected, and especially forest bird assemblages. They're altered pretty much at the very beginning when forests are pretty much cleared and removed on these mountains to actually start the mining process. And so after he they talked about that. They discussed that forest obligate birds are the most impacted. They're very sensitive, and their occupancy and their abundances declined pretty much species wide on forest obligate birds. And then core forest birds, which need like this continuous track of closed canopy forest, they're affected the most. But basically, they said that each species is affected slightly different because some birds, the edges around these mines are what affect them. Um, And they kind of talked about reclaim sites a lot too, and they stated that some of these birds, if reclaimed the correct way, actually don't mind using them, which is a really good sign. And then they also talked about grassland species are pretty happy with these sites, especially reclaims, not to begin with, but this creates a habitat type that isn't found anywhere else on the landscape. So they normally increase after this type of coal mining and then reclamation that happens. And they also talked about that wetland birds use the water found in these areas as long as it's not too toxic. And raptors actually increase in abundance as well around these sites. Normally, if they are restored in a more of a grassland type habitat. And so I cited this paper at the very end for all of y'all that want to see it or read it. I thought it was a very fascinating read. And so then we also learned about the Central Valley from Matt Kaminsky. And so here on the right-hand side, this is a map pretty close to what Matt talked about and just so shows the Central Valley in California. And so we talked about why the Central Valley was really important prior to the 1800s and settlement. And that was because there were over 4 million acres of wetlands present in that valley. And so many of these were seasonal wetlands, but they were very diverse from the north to the south. Like they were not all the same. There was a lot of riparian, there were lakes, there were vernal pools, just whatever you could think of, it was there. And you also had Tallulah Lake, which was the largest lake west of the Mississippi at 65,000 acres. And it was a really shallow lake, so lots of vegetation growing in it. And then we also talked about what exactly does Ducks Unlimited, what are their management styles in the San Joaquin, Joaquin Valley in the Central Valley of California. Basically, we talked about they fix relift pumps and pump stations to move water. They improve canals and water conveyance structures. And then they improve wetland footprints and levees. So basically, these are the biggest things that they're doing there because that basically they just need to figure out how to move water. That's the biggest thing here. And they're also constructing swales, installing pipelines for irrigation in more grassland type habitats. And then they're installing water control systems so that big dikes, big flooding systems, levees, and they're fixing radial gates on already existing structures. And they also do native grassland or grass restoration with no-till drilling. And so there's a lot of stuff that DU seems to be doing, and it all seemed pretty fascinating. I was really surprised by all of it. And then the paper that we had to read talked about the non-pollutants and their effects on avian communities. And so I was actually really surprised by some of these and was really interesting on it. And the paper was titled Warning of Non-Pollutants and Their Effects on Avian Communities. So we're going to start with light pollution and basically talk about what each one of these, how it affects birds. So light pollution disrupts birds' internal circadian clock. It affects daily and seasonal um, singing patterns and then sleep. Birds will vocalize earlier in the morning and then later in the evening. And then some use lit structures. So a positive in certain aspects, they use lit structures to actually catch insects, which was kind of a fascinating thing because everything else seems to be relatively negative when it comes to light pollution. And then light pollution can lower survival due to lack of rest, and then basically lower quality males sing more and earlier in light pollution, which can become an evolutionary problem because it means that unfavorable males are actually getting the mates when they shouldn't be. It basically just affects fitness and stress sensitivity, and millions of birds die from collisions with lit structures a year. And then disorientation during migration was another big one. With noise pollution, basically birds use low frequency songs sometimes, and those bird species are pretty much non-existent in urban environments because they can't communicate or vocalize and communicate with mates or however. And then some birds adjust their calls to higher pitch so that they can be heard. Call complexity increases with noise, which is a really fascinating thing. And then basically, noise creates fragmented sleep, which leads to stress, and then can change ecological interactions. And it also degrades habitat quality overall. And then they talked about air pollutants. So basically, air pollution really came down to heavy metals, and they're inhaling those, and the birds close to these environments are the most at risk, like urban environments. And basically, birds are very sensitive to air quality, so air pollutants are really bad. The whole thing with like canary in the coal mine, like they use birds to test the air. So that was an interesting thing. And then air pollution basically just elevates stress levels, and it may change habitats and habits of birds in those urban habitats. Then heavy metal pollution was things like lead and mercury. And they basically accumulate in the tissues of these birds and then bioaccumulate in the chain, the food web as it moves up, which is a really dangerous thing. Um, it affects blood and feathers, which is really fascinating. Lead is the biggest killer of birds when it comes to heavy metals, but then mercury affects embryos and nervous systems. And so molting gets rid of mercury, which is a really fascinating thing that I didn't know was possible. Um, and then, but reproduction is often the thing that's messed with when it comes to the metal pollution, specifically mercury, and then hormone production as well. And so then the next one was radioactive pollution. So birds are generally negatively affected. Um, it lowers their survival rate and reproductive success, and it affects brain development, especially in younger birds. It may affect bird abundance, but they did find that GPS trackers, so like that kind of electromagnetic radiation, can reduce fitness of birds, and not the weight of it. It's the electromagnetic radiation coming off of it, which was crazy. And then one of the bigger ones was pesticide pollution. So super high mortality, something like 67 to 72 million birds killed per year, and I do believe that was in the U.S. It's present in pesticides are pretty much everywhere in our food system. Herbicide it affects shrub and canopy nesters, and lots of indirect effects with the herbicide. Fungicide and systemic poisoning, that's a big one. So the endocrine system is affected. Insecticides, basically, um, most linked to bird issues because you're killing their food source, but then they're also eating some of those poisons through their food. So that's kind of scary. And then rodenticides enter into the predator food web through like raptors and scavengers. Pharmaceutical pollution basically talked about activated sludge being a byproduct, but then it's like put out into the system, out into like fields and all this other stuff. But then they can like pharmaceuticals going into livestock when those livestock die, they can cause severe renal failure in scavengers. And then they also talked about that male birds find drugged females less attractive, so this affects mate selection maybe indirectly. And then oil pollution is one that we know about, extremely poisonous to birds, because they're very susceptible, it seems. If external contact of 10% occurs, the bird is likely to die. Ingestion is just as bad. Um, and then, so basically, oil pollution can change reproduction, physiology, and behaviors of birds or bird populations. And then lastly, plastic pollution is one of the most prevalent threats, but it's not super highly reported in terrestrial bird species, but mainly in marines. species because they ingest plastic as they're scooping up seafood or seafood, excuse me, sea life. And then basically plastic pollution causes a lot of physical uh deaths, physical damage internally a lot of times, but it can also leach out, cause chemical issues as well. And so after kind of going through all these, it was really interesting to learn about it all because I didn't know about a lot. And kind of my takeaway was in my brain, and I'm also reading Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring, um, and she talks about pesticides and herbicides or those things a lot, and basically chemicals. And so in my brain, after reading that book and then reading this paper, my takeaway is that the one that we should be most worried about are pesticides because they're pretty much everywhere you look. They're in all our foods. They're in everything's food web now, it seems. And it's kind of just like an unseen evil. And it's really sad and really concerning. But then the one that I least expected was the pharmaceutical pollution. I had never heard of like a byproduct sludge that they spread out on fields, and I thought that was kind of crazy. And then it was really interesting to think that, you know, things, not chemicals, but drugs being put into livestock, when those livestock die, it can kill the scavengers that eat it. So it's a lot of things that we just don't think about, I feel. But I definitely think that the most important one that we should be concerned about is pesticide pollution. And then my least expected was definitely the pharmaceutical pollution. And so these are my citations for the paper, and this is the citations for the photos. I really enjoyed this paper and doing this oral presentation. I thought all of it was really, really interesting. So hope you enjoy. Thanks.